welcome to History in Lowell. My name is Maritza Grooms. I'm joined by my buddy Bob, of course, Bob Forrant, my partner in history crime. And we have a guest today, very special guest, Dr. Sarah Buchmeier. Thank you for joining us today.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm so glad that you could come today. We got to meet you last week at our screening of A Contradictory Place, which was very cool and interesting, and you asked some really great questions, and we really appreciate people who ask us questions that are good. But you're not here to talk about us. We're here to talk about you and the work that you're doing here. So you're here as a Mellon's Fellow.
Yes.
Did I say that correctly?
It's technically a long title. So the official title is NPS Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow. And it is, the fellowship is a partnership between the National Park Service, the Mellon Foundation and the National Park Foundation, and facilitated through the American Conservation Experience. And I am one of 15 fellows who are scattered all across the country in different national park sites, both the individual sites and sometimes regional offices, working on a variety of different humanities projects. Yeah. So I get to be here in Lowell, which is really exciting. Yeah.
I like the way you said that. I get to be here in Lowell.
Yeah.
So did you pick to come here?
I did.
Did they give you options and then you said that's where I want to go?
Yeah. So each park had their own sort of call and a description of the project. I applied specifically for Lowell. A lot of my interest came from where I was before coming to Lowell, which was Pullman National Historical Park in Chicago. It's on the far south side of Chicago. Yep. It is also a big labor history site.
I went there once.
Oh, did you really?
I went to Haymarket Square. I did the whole thing.
Was it a national park at the time, or
no? It wasn't quite there yet.
Yeah. I had the great the great fortune of having my Chicago neighborhood become a national park site while I was living there. So it was designated in 2015.
Yeah, it was before then.
And then I sort of randomly got a job as a seasonal park ranger in the summer. And then eventually became a permanent park ranger working on the education programs. And then I saw this opportunity at Lowell, and I had heard about Lowell. I was very interested in especially the connections with Pullman.
I'm sure a lot of people are saying, what the hell is Pullman?
So Pullman was a company town built in 1880 by the Pullman Palace Car Company, which is famous for making these luxury rail cars, named after George Pullman, who put his name on everything. So the Pullman cars, the Pullman Company, the town of Pullman. And so it's an interesting site that all of the manufacturing was in the center of the town, and then there were workers housing on either side that accommodated not just the factory workers that you think of, building the cars, but the executives as well. So it was kind of a mixed income neighborhood, which was really innovative. And had
Lowell wouldn't know about that.
Right, and had all these, amazing luxuries like indoor plumbing. For all of the workers. And it was meant to be a kind of ideal, a capitalist adventure, right, or venture that was supposed to be mutually beneficial. Now, of course, as I know you know, in 1893 there was a big economic recession, and that meant less business for the Pullman Company. Pullman reduced the wages of the workers, but didn't reduce the rent on the homes that
Sounds
the workers.
familiar.
And so that precipitated a big strike in 1894. It lasted for about 2 months. The short version of the story is that in early July, Grover Cleveland, the president at the time, sent in federal troops to break up the strike, ostensibly to protect the mail. There are all kinds of nuances to that, right? That was at least the sort of excuse for the government to step in.
Because rail cars delivered the mail.
Exactly.
So if there's no, and around the country, other workers in sympathy, stopped working on any trains that had Pullman cars.
Yes.
In an effort at solidarity to help try to figure out a way to get the workers to win. So that's
Right. Yeah,
That's
so
how he-
there
that's
was
why he
there was
acted,
this
right.
sort of nationwide attention to what started out as just one, company strike, and the sort of consolation prize for the workers was the establishment of Labor Day as a national holiday.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
you can sort of draw a straight line from the Pullman strike
Yep.
to the day that we all get off in September. And then the other big story with the Pullman Company is outside of the factory and outside of the town. That's the story of the Pullman porters, who were the service workers on the cars themselves. So if you rode a Pullman car, you had someone there to bring you the newspaper and fetch a glass of water and then make up the beds that the cars would convert into. Those reporters, they were an all African American workforce.
Wow.
And so, they weren't really part of that 1894 strike because at that time they weren't allowed to be members of the union. And but they formed their own union in 1925, headed by A. Philip Randolph. It took them 12 years to get a contract with the company. But they were successful, and then A. Philip Randolph would go on to become a prominent civil rights organizer, one of the organizers of the March on Washington. So there are just a lot of really cool stories.
It's a really I teach. Actually last week I did the strike and
Oh, it was
talked
just
about-
last
yeah,
week. Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
Talked about,
Wow.
yeah, but just the week before that we
Yeah.
met, and my students are amazed by that sort of the pull through
Yeah.
of Labor Day, and again, it's like we celebrate Labor Day in this country, and most people have no reason, no
Right.
particular. The other interesting for me part of the Pullman strike is the role of Eugene Debs,
Yes.
who becomes this somewhat from the strike, but for a few other things that are happening in the time, he becomes what I don't know if you would agree, but one of the more significant labor
Absolutely.
spokespersons of
Yeah.
as well as anti-war and
Yeah.
anti-draft, and
Right.
he becomes a really incredible. So in the museum area, do you talk about him as well?
Yeah,
or-
Debs is definitely a figure within the exhibits,
Nice.
and we talk about him a lot. And
That sounds like a place I would like to work.
oh yeah,
Maybe one day we could do a field trip.
exactly. Yeah, and there are some really cool, not just the resonances, but very direct connections between Lowell and Pullman. Actually, if you go to the exhibits in the boot, you'll see some advertisements from the Pullman cars, because what I've heard is that the upholstery
Yeah,
for the
mohair.
Pullman cars were made here.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at one of the things I want to sort of dig up is the records for that.
There's a mohair plush company that was big in Lowell that is over off Jackson Street, that the university now owns one of the buildings.
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
realize that, that's where the stuff went to Pullman.
Yeah, right.
I know they were selling stuff to Ford.
Yeah, I
They
think
were
that was
selling
a big.
some of the stuff for car upholstery seats as well.
Yeah, and
so-
I don't know the details of how long Pullman was a client or
Wow,
that sort of stuff. But those are some of the things that I'm trying to
It's amazing.
to uncover.
I mean, Debs eventually runs for president at one point
from
jail.
prison. Yeah,
From prison.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
yeah, he's a really cool figure. For
Wow.
He
sure.
goes to
Yeah.
prison for violating, during World War I, the president at the time, Wilson, signs into law some executive orders and whatnot to basically curtail freedom of speech. And one of the things you can't do is counsel people not to be drafted or sign up for the war. And Debs goes around the country basically giving speeches to workers, saying this is a rich man's war, you're just cannon fodder, basically. And ultimately they arrest him and throw him into prison. And he runs in 1920, right? Is it
I think
1920?
I think that's right.
And he gets over 1 million votes.
yeah.
Who does he run against? I should probably know this.
Pardon?
Who does he run against? I said I should probably know this.
Who's elected that year?
1920 in Harding.
Okay.
Oh.
Warren G. Harding's
okay.
elected.
Wow.
And so, but he runs from jail. So Harding's a Republican. I actually should know the Democrat, and I forget. And then Debs is third candidate on the Socialist Party ticket. And Debs is really influential because around New England as well, he comes and speaks around here too. I mean, he was in Lowell in 1916.
Was he really?
Yeah. He was
More
doing
connections.
Yeah, he was doing a whistle stop around,
Okay.
and he spoke on the South Common.
Wow.
And so, again, talking about the war, but also talking about organizing. He had been to Lawrence as well because of the Bread and Roses strike.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, like, one of the things I'm fascinated by is, and we both are, I shouldn't say just me, we both are on the show, about like historical memory, like what gets saved, what gets collected, and so that has to be part of what you must have been thinking about at Pullman, but here as well, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
What's left, what's in the story, what should be in the story that isn't in the story.
Yeah.
How hard is that to try to construct?
Oh my goodness. A very big question. Well, so my degree is in English, so I call myself a kind of fake historian, because we do, as English folks, we do a little bit of history in order to be able to sort of make sense of the text. But one of the things that I think about all the time is how the shape of the narrative can change what you see, and what gets put in the frame, right? And that can be, that really depends on who's telling the story, who's the one speaking, but also how you tell the story. Right. So, when we think about Lowell, for example, a lot of times the story is a kind of rise, fall, renewal story, which really comes out of putting the focus on economics of the city, right? So, how many jobs were there? How many spindles were going? What was being produced? But the shape of that story will change if you focus on immigration, for example, right? What are the different flows of people that are coming in, and the jobs kind of gets put into the background, and so I'm sort of constantly thinking about, and the thing that I love to look at in the archive is all the little details that are sort of around the main stories that we tell, that might not have anything to do with what we, what we're trying to preserve. For example, I was looking at some of the letters from the Lowell family. So when Francis Cabot Lowell was off in England and Scotland, kind of spying on.
When he was doing espionage.
Doing his,
That's how I always tell that story.
Right. For his health, which I'm sure was also a legitimate reason. But sort of mixed in these letters are their shopping list, basically, their grocery list, and what things were called. They wanted American apples. And so what that meant, what kinds of apples those were. Those are things that I'm sort of fascinated with including. But part of the reason, part of the big project that I have in coming here is thinking about the exhibits over at the Boot Mills. Because they want to redesign those sometime in the, let's say, near future.
In the millennium.
In the millennium.
We know how long it took for the immigration one to.
Yeah, right. It's not just planning, but it's money and things like that. So, but yeah, how do you sort of weave together all of these different stories, and kind of open up the history of Lowell to some of the bigger, not just national, but sometimes global stories as well.
Yeah, I guess I don't really even think about Lowell globally. I always think about us as a microcosm of what's happening on the national stage, but I never think about us globally.
Right.
And when we're telling our stories here in this space, we're always thinking about who's left out, whose voices aren't heard. And that's what prompted us, I think, even to do the show in the first place. And why we continue to do it, and why we try to find these kinds of stories. But people don't think about that. When you're learning about history in school, who gets to decide what part of the story gets told? And if you ask any Lowell kid, what's the history of Lowell? They'll probably talk about the mill girls, and that might be it.
Sure.
You know, they don't realize that the streets that you're walking down are the names of, you know, the Boston Manufacturing Company guys, you know, and that whole gang. And they don't realize any of that.
Yeah.
Or, you know, how we talk about the ties to the enslaved folks down south. You don't think about the free black folks walking around at the time, you know, you don't think about the immigration groups and how they all work together to also for strikes and things. You don't think about how all of that is connected and the stories outside of that. And one thing I like about the One City Many Cultures exhibit is that dinner table piece. There's like the dinner table where different families are sitting down talking about just regular things that you would talk about with your family, but it's like showing aspects of the culture, it's showing different social issues from the present to the past, all of these things. How do you decide what gets put into an exhibit? And I think we asked Emily that before, Park Ranger Emily, but how do you decide that?
And it's hard, right? And the, you know, the other group that I'm really interested in are the boarding house keepers. And, you know, because we think about the Lowell as, you know, this hub of, you know, female workers, and we think about the mill girls. But there's this whole other workforce of boarding house keepers who are doing the domestic labor to support the mill girls, which not only supports the industry, but also supports the mill girls being able to attend lectures and read and do all of these things, the other things that they were really famous for. So I think that's a really, those are harder, those women are harder to track, I think.
Right. Yep, I mean the old city directories and things like that, you can get some.
You can get into
we know,
some
I've been
names.
doing some research on Benjamin Butler, because Butler becomes famous in the Civil War, but when he's in Lowell, his mom is a boarding house keeper. And Butler later in the 1840s and 1850s is more sympathetic. Butler starts buying up mills and becoming a bit of an entrepreneur as well as an attorney. And he treats workers better in his mills. He pays them more money and such. And I often try to, my speculation is that he was living in the boarding house when his mom was a boarding house keeper, and he probably overheard people talking and heard, and that somehow, that's what I don't know, because I don't see it written down. So this is why I think this way. But so try to infer.
People tend not to do that, unfortunately.
And so that's a problem, right? That you have to sort of say, okay, well, what would happen to me if I was in that setting? And a normal person would, right? I mean, I started doing a thing the other day, which I haven't gotten very far on, but I was getting ready to do a unit on Native American history and on the extermination of the buffalo, because Ken Burns just did a documentary on the buffalo, and there's a lot in there, and I wanted to do something with my students, and in passing I read something about how buffalo hides were used in the belts that ran machinery in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that's where a lot of the hides ended up.
Interesting.
And I immediately thought, well, is there a Lowell connection? Because again, with cotton or whatever, like I'm always trying to figure out, okay, well, and so I've been asking everybody I know if they've run across anything ever about any of the belts and the machinery in Lowell. And I found this tannery in New Hampshire that was in existence back in the mid to late 19th century and still is, and I contacted them and said, do you have any record? And they said that they thought that in New England it was mostly cowhide, not buffalo, and that buffalo was a phenomenon in the Midwest, and that's as far as I got. But that sounds kind of like what you're, like it's like that jigsaw, right? You're trying to figure out what other piece can I insert here.
But yeah, that reminds me of another connection, sort of more abstract connection between Lowell and Pullman, is how the sort of architecture and the infrastructure helped kind of produce worker solidarity. So I know I think in your film you talk about the boarding houses as
breeding grounds of discontent.
That's one of my favorite lines.
One of my favorite lines ever.
Because what did they do? They put all of their workers into homes together so that they could
Right.
sit around the table or, sit and do their sewing and complain about their overseers and complain about their wages and compare notes, right? And Pullman has a very similar kind of situation where, the workers were in their own homes, but they're row homes. They share walls and they have shared porches. And so people would sit out on the porches, and chances are,
Yep.
because of the way it was designed, your neighbor was making about the same salary or wage that you were. You were probably in the same department too. And so, whatever was bothering you at work, maybe where it was too noisy to talk about at work, you could talk about it, when you got home. So it is interesting how, the capitalists are thinking about efficiency, and they end up
Right.
creating sort of this group of workers who are,
A
in
student of
solidarity with
mine
each other.
did research on the Bread and Roses strike, and she was interested in the women strikers. And she got her hands on all the arrest records during the strike, the
how
jail
cool.
records.
Yeah.
And she was able to go through the arrest records, and with a computer and mapping software, map out where the women lived who got arrested.
Yeah.
And on the day they got arrested, and what she discovered was there would be certain days where many women would all get arrested on the same day, and they were all from the same block.
Interesting.
And so we basically talked about that, and she sort of said, she said at one point, I wonder if they were, Sophie, who came here and talked about this, right? I wonder if they plotted together to go get arrested.
Right. Yeah.
And I said, well, maybe not exactly get arrested, but they plotted together to go out and do something.
Right.
And then they got arrested.
Yeah.
But it can't be that random. That
Right,
On the same
exactly.
day, all these people that live in the same tenement
Yeah.
all got arrested. But it's the same kind of,
Exactly.
it's exactly that, which you don't necessarily think about until you get down to it, like what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's also fascinating just listening to the two of you think about how those actions of the people in the past brought us all together today to be able to, the fact that you're doing all this work in Chicago and that it made you want to come here and that you can find all of these links just by doing this research. And that student, Sophie is already just amazing. I feel like she goes above and beyond, but to know that that's the amount of research that you have to do in order to get any kind of information and to be able to make inferences and interpret that kind of information to then relay it to other people.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I obviously, I'm a fan of the both of you, so I really could just sit here and listen to you talk all day.
And then you have to rely on the fact that in the case, in what you're describing, or Sophie and that work with the arrest records, that some documentation survives.
Right.
Otherwise, you're just completely flying by the seat of your pants. And you can do that, but you're just taking leaps of faith, right? Whereas if you have letters or documents or the architecture, you can look at those row houses and photographs and diaries and other things and say, okay, this stands to reason, right? But if you didn't have, so that's maybe for another show. But this question of what gets collected, right? Which I'm sure is something that you thought about at Pullman as well as what you're thinking about here. What's in the archive and what isn't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the stories about Pullman is they had the Great Chicago Fire happened in 1871. Am I am I getting my Chicago years right? I'm always forgetting those things. But Pullman had offices downtown, and so they were scrambling to save all their records. Well, what records did they not really care to keep was a lot of the records about the porters. Or there were maids as well, who were not as many, but another part of that African-American workforce. And they are a little bit harder to find in the archive because they didn't have separate forms for the maids. They would use the same forms for the porters and just sort of cross off Porter and put maid, and so there, you know, there isn't like a separate box or a separate folder for like the records for the maids, and so yeah, you do. It sometimes is a little bit of digging through the haystack, right, to see what you might be able to find and discover.
Yeah, which then, right, that's the crapshoot of like stumbling on. I did a project a few years ago in Hatfield, and for whatever reason, the company saved all the letters that were written to them by people looking for jobs.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Which is very, I had never seen anything like it. And letters from Poland and Germany and Hungary, and I want to relocate. Is there any, this is a place that was looking for a skilled machinist. And they would write their resume into the letter. And so finding those letters was, for me, it was like I was dancing around and people were looking at me like I was crazy. But I said, like, you just don't find. And I had never even thought that people did such a thing.
Right, yeah.
And so it just opened up a whole other way for me to think about, like, how are people networking, immigrants trying to find jobs, family networks, whatever it would be. But you're right, like, what gets saved and what doesn't.
Right, yeah.
Wow.
And the Porters are so important to the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a conduit for all sorts of news from the train.
Right, yeah. They're incredibly influential with the Great Migration. So there was a paper called the Chicago Defender, that provided information about, you know, how to travel north, what jobs were available, and the Porters would kind of sneak that paper onto the train with them, and so they were going all over the country. They had a mobility that a lot of folks didn't have at the time, and they would toss that paper out the window, or you know, or distribute it in these sort of secret ways, and so they got, you know, they were able to sort of help people move to the north and find.
It was like an Underground
jobs.
Railroad sort of.
Exactly.
Early 20th century style.
Right, yeah, for sure.
Wow. Sarah, this has been so fascinating learning about all the incredible work that you've done, the real investigative work that you've done. I've learned so much to say. I'm going to have to rewatch this episode and then try to do some research of my own, because you guys have, Bob always tells me things I don't know. So it's always great to have someone else to come and tell me more things I don't know.
That's the fun part of these conversations.
Exactly.
Right?
I'm learning so many things. And, you know, to have you here in Lowell, I can't wait to see what new things you uncover here in Lowell, and how we'll see if we find more links to Pullman, see if we find more links to things that maybe we don't know. I would be interested in what you can discover that might stump Bob.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
So we'll have to have you on
Buffalo
again.
Hides,
Yeah, for sure.
That's my new mission.
Yes, this has all been so wonderful. Thank you for coming on the show.
It was such a pleasure.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that we can have you, even if it's just for a few years. Do you have any ideas what you're going to do after?
I don't know. All of my family is back in Chicago, so they're expecting me to go back home. But
But you're falling in love with Lowell, and who knows what can happen. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks.
And thank you, Bob, for I just love you. That's my TV dad. That's what I tell everybody. He's my personal professor. So thank you for coming and teaching me, because that's really what History in Lowell is all about, is teaching Maritza, because if I can learn it, that means all of you out there in TV land, YouTube land, or if you're listening on a podcast or some sort, you can learn this too. And thank you for making the information accessible and fun and interesting. And I can't wait to see what else you learn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been History in Lowell.